Welcome to the Veritas Forum, engaging university students and faculty in discussions about life's hardest questions and the relevance of Jesus Christ to all of life.
Thank you, Jeremy. Thank you all. It's a tremendous pleasure to be here. I've driven up Highway 1 many times, but I confess I've never come into San Luis Obispo or seen Cal Poly, and my day here has been delightful. So it's a genuine privilege for me. Some of you know one of my heroes in life, and the man I met when I was a teenager, Sir Winston Churchill. And there are many wonderful stories about his exchanges with people. One of my favorites is a time he was at university, but in Canada. And it was a commencement. And they knew the great man loved whiskey. So it was before noon, and he didn't typically drink before noon, but they offered him whiskey, and he loved whiskey. He took some, and since he took some, they went all the way down the platform party, and they all solemnly took whiskey too. Until they got to the Methodist bishop at the end of the line, evidently a rather small man, and he stood up to his full height and he said loudly, "I would rather commit adultery than drink whiskey." Churchill heard this and said, "Oh, please come back. I didn't know we were being given a choice tonight." That always reminds me of the way some well-intentioned people, speaking on behalf of faith or ethics, just put their foot in it. Now, the wonderful thing about the Veritas Forum, and I've had the privilege, I don't work for them, work in Washington, D.C. in the public policy world. But the wonderful thing about the Veritas Forum is everything's open to challenge. None of us pretends we have all the answers in life. But we're making various arguments. People are here as seekers and skeptics or whatever. And we're all open to discussion and to challenge. And that's what I love about Veritas, the assumption that there is truth, but none of us knows all the answers. So we're making our arguments, and I look forward to the discussion afterwards with any of you chipping in who might like to. Let me begin with 3 stories tonight that lead us into what I want to try and share with you, and truly it's a privilege for me. As a speaker, you go around and you get some questions that come up again and again and again, and every so often really off-the-wall ones. And one that's come up several times in the last 5 years in this country, people say to me, maybe because I'm getting a little older, if you had your choice, which generation would you like to have been born in and live in? I'm never quite sure what they mean. Would I like to have been with Pericles in the great days of Athens, or whatever? My answer is always the same after the first time when I was surprised. And that is, I would like to be born in your generation. Because as people who are far-sighted in our world are looking at the impact of globalization and all the huge questions arising in our world, your generation, people who are now between 18 and 35, you are described as the crunch generation. In the sense that many of the trends and the forces in the world are all coming together and raising ginormous questions for humankind, which your generation in your adulthood will have to answer. One man describes it as humankind going through a canyon. And if we want smooth sailing afterwards, wise, responsible choices will have to be made again in your adulthood. And that's a tremendous privilege and a challenge for you. And of course, you'll have to think through, what is the meaning of life? What are the rights and wrongs? What do you bring to the discussion about human dignity and so on? And that's what interests me tonight. Challenging your generation to live up to the extraordinary moment in which we're living. The second way in, many years ago, I was speaking in London with a man who was very well known in the 1960s called E.F. Schumacher, who wrote a very famous bestseller called Small is Beautiful. And he began his series of lectures with a story he'd just come back from what was then Leningrad, today St. Petersburg. but it was still under the Soviet rule. And he'd gone from his hotel and he'd followed the map very, very closely. But he found himself in front of some great golden-domed Russian Orthodox churches, and they weren't on the map. And he was sure he hadn't made a mistake. And the guide, seeing him puzzled, the Soviet guide, came up to him and said, "What is it?" He explained, and she said, "Oh, I can explain that. In the Soviet Union, we don't mark churches on the map." Schumacher said, "Oh, yes, you do. Here's one." "Oh, no," she said. "That's a dead church, a museum. We don't mark living churches in the map." And Schumacher said in London in his lecture, that wasn't the first time, and he was a great European intellectual, it wasn't the first time where he'd felt that his own experience was contradicted by the maps of knowledge, and in Europe, people didn't take his faith seriously. Here he was, an incredible intellectual, but in many of the European universities, they were so secular and skeptical, they didn't even discuss the issues that he knew so well that most people did. And that, sadly, is true of many American universities. Socrates said very simply, the unexamined life is not worth living. But sadly, on many American campuses today, people don't even think about the meaning of life. And they're so concerned about their disciplines and their career and their grades and various things, that many of the deep questions of being a human being are never even raised. And that's one of the great things about Veritas. It raises questions about the big issues, the deep questions of life. The third thing, just by way of introduction, is a time when I myself was in hospital in northern Fairfax many years ago with a suspected brain tumor. And I was about to go into the MRI of the time. And the nurse said to me, "Are you claustrophobic?" I said, "No." "Why do you ask?" She said, "Well, our nickname for the MRI scanner is the coffin machine." And I said, "Thanks very much," and just laughed and didn't think anything of it until I lay in the thing. And in the several times I did it, particularly the first time, it was as if I was in my own coffin. And all the years of my life and the decades of my life, and I was, as Jeremy said, I was born in China, saw the climax of the Chinese Revolution. And my parents witnessed things like the rape of Nanking and the horror of the Japanese War and so on. And all the years of my life, from the early days in China, I've lived on 3 continents, met many extraordinary people in my years. And it all just scrolled down before me as in Technicolor and made me think, as I'd never done before, of life as a journey. And that's what I want to speak to you about tonight. Not making a grand argument, much more issuing an invitation. If you think for a minute, the deepest, almost universal picture of human life is as a journey. If you take even our Western literature, the Exodus, the Odyssey, the Aeneid, the Canterbury Tales, Don Quixote, Pilgrim's Progress, Huckleberry Finn, and you can come right down to modern books like Jack Kerouac's On the Road. What are they all about? What we discover about ourselves as we see our lives on planet Earth as a journey. And here you all tonight, and this is one thing that absolutely unites us. I'm a man, many of you are women. I'm a European, presumably most of you are Americans. There are a lot of things that might make us different in various ways, but the one thing that unites us all, we are all human beings on a journey. Dante says at the beginning of the Divine Comedy, which is about a journey, midway in life I found myself in a dark wood. And then he goes on from there. We know now, he didn't know it, he wrote the Divine Comedy when he was 35. And he died at 70. Exactly midway, as his poem said, on the journey of his own life. But here we all are. And all of us are somewhere between our birth and our death. And we didn't choose the day we were born, and we don't know the day we'll die. And the great challenge is to live this extraordinary life and to make the most of it. And that's what I want to talk about tonight. The journey of life and how it is we make sense of life and enter into a life that really has meaning and fulfillment. So what I'm saying is not, as I said, an argument against something or for something in any logical way that you'd look at, say, in the philosophy department. We can do that. That's not what I'm interested in tonight, because that would divide many people. People interested in philosophy might go along with it. But I'm speaking to us all, and to myself, as human beings on the journey of life. Now, if you read the stories of humans thinking about that journey, as I think of my own story, of the people I've met in my own life, and I've met many of the great thinkers of the 20th century, you can see that there are certain clear stages. It's not as if everyone goes through this mechanically, any more than if you go up in an elevator. You're not thinking first floor, second floor, third. You just go up. You're there where you arrive. Many people think like that. They're just quickly through all the stages. But if you slow it down and think more carefully, you can see certain clearly discernible phases or stages in a thinking person's quest for meaning. Now, I'm not for a minute presuming that everyone thinks. But you should at a good university like this. The first stage is the one I want to concentrate on more tonight than maybe the others, because it's the stage that gets people moving. And stage one of a thinking person's quest for meaning is a time for questions. Suddenly something happens in life, in their minds or in their hearts or in their world, and life becomes a question. Maybe a crisis, it may be a need, it may be some challenge intellectually, but life becomes a question, and the person becomes a seeker. Now, of course, most people are not even there. And that's why I said I want to spend some time on this one to challenge every one of you at least to get there. If Socrates is right, the unexamined life is not worth living, you've got to start thinking and questioning even to begin to lead an examined life. And yet many people live happy-go-lucky lives, indifferent to the deep issues of the world. What does it mean, though, when life becomes a question? Freud or his followers would dive in immediately and say, there you are. People who have a faith have it growing out of a need. So faith is only a projection or a crutch or a wish fulfillment or so on. It's not true. Freud actually got it wrong. Nobody believes because of their needs or a crisis. What actually happens is they disbelieve in what they used to believe because of some challenge that what they used to believe doesn't answer. And so they become a seeker. And the first stage is always about questions that turn people into seekers in a quest for meaning. They haven't found anything at that first stage. Now, think what lies behind it, though. I'm a social scientist. In my field, people say very simply, all human beings have a search for meaning and belonging. Meaning is what allows us to make sense of the world. Belonging is what allows us to find security in life. And we all, whether we think about it or not, have a deep need for meaning and belonging. You can see this down through human thinking. Plato calls this the fact that humans need a raft to sail through the storms of life. Aldous Huxley, many years later, talked about it as a cave that people find for themselves to ride out the storms of life. But whatever picture you use, a meaning and a belonging. Jesus, like Buddha, and many of the other world's religious leaders called it a way. But a way of life that leads to meaning and belonging. Now, you might immediately ask, if that is as basic as I'm saying, why on earth don't people think about it more of the time? Because the simple fact is a lot of people don't. And there are two very profound answers given to that. And you ask yourself whether these are true of some of you or some of the friends that you know. One answer to why people don't think is what Pascal, the great French scientist and the grandfather of the computer, what Pascal called diversion. Humans don't want to face the fact that we're all going to die. And however long we live, it's only so many years, give or take a few, from the 70 years and 10. So death is at the end for all of us, but most people don't want to face that. And so they, as Pascal said, divert themselves. They surround themselves with busy, entertaining distractions so as not to have to think. And you can see that our generation, with all sorts of electronic things, can distract itself and divert itself as never before. But it's not just ordinary people, say teenagers into the world of their iPads or whatever. You can think of, say, philosophers. David Hume, the great Scottish skeptic in the Enlightenment, he admitted quite openly that when his thinking as an atheist led into such black despair, he would turn from it to backgammon and play backgammon with his friends to take his mind off it. I was an undergraduate at London University at a time when the campaign for nuclear disarmament was at its strongest. And many times I either saw and sometimes met in our seminars Bertrand Russell, one of the great minds of the 20th century, and a grand old humanist and atheist. And he admitted openly he would read at the end of his life 2 novels a week to take his mind off the extinction of the universe. Diversion. And many people do it. Simple ways, profound ways. They'd rather not face the fullness of reality. But there's another way discussed, particularly in Western literature, and that's, in one word, what's called bargaining. People don't want to think about the meaning of life, so it's later. When I've graduated, after I'm married, when I've paid the mortgage, when my kids are grown up, when I'm retired, or whatever. Always later, 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 and finally, we run out of laters. And of course, Western literature has figures like Faust, who's the person who always wants more knowledge, and more experience, and more power. And finally, his life runs out, and he does his bargain with the devil, but he doesn't read the small print. And finally, there's a day when there's no more later. But you can see that whether it's diversion, busy, entertaining distraction, or people who want to bargain with life and put the big questions off and off and off and off, many people simply don't think about the meaning of life. But why do people think? Well, there are certain very obvious reasons. You could just take human passages. Now, it just happens that most of you here tonight are in one of the periods in which most people do think somewhat about the big questions of life. Churchill called this the Big Seven, the years between 18 and 25, and now we can put 25 off to a long time, 35, 45, people finishing their doctorates and so on in our world today. But you can see there is a period when people are thinking about life, when people are meeting the person they're going to marry, when people are thinking about the careers they're going to pick up and so on. And you happen to be in one of those passages when that's more normal. Then, of course, you can have health crises later or midlife crises, and the end of life comes. I mean, you who are under 20, you're immortal. You only have to get to 30, 35, 45, and you realize that going down the river, there are rapids. And after so many bends in the river, you can hear the rapids, and I can hear them pretty loudly. Some of you have no idea that there are any rapids or anything's going to come at the end like death. But the very passages in life challenge people to think. Or another reason why people think are the grand historical events that falsify beliefs. Take, say, the 20th century beliefs in Marxism. There were many people for whom it was the revelation of the Ukrainian famine that began to shake their faith in people like Stalin. And then the disclosures of the gulags. And then, of course, in 1989, communism fell. And all over the world, people were disillusioned. Arthur Koestler, the great scientist, he had written earlier a book called The God That Failed. He's talking about Marxism. And Marxism, simply by history, was falsified. Now, you still find in some of the American universities tenured 60s radicals who still believe in an undiluted form the old Marxist style. But for most people, it's an antiquated belief that no one believes in today. But what I've always been interested in is a third way of why people think. And that's the individual experiences in their lives that trigger a search. My mentor in the social sciences, Peter Berger, calls this signals of transcendence. Experiences which contain within them something that prompts thoughts that lead people beyond what they believe, whatever they believe at a certain time, and turns them into seekers. People for whom life has become a question, and they set out to find an answer. Let me give you some examples. Many of you may not have heard of the great early 20th century English journalist G.K. Chesterton, one of the great writers of the last century. He went to college in London in the 1890s. And the mood where he was in the art college he went to was rather like a postmodern mood today, somewhat cynical, bitter, pessimistic, ironic, you name it. And as he says, as a student, he was flirting with a very dark philosophy of life. But he said what stopped him and always left him short of being total cynic and a total pessimist was, as he said, he was stopped in his tracks, I'm quoting him, stopped in his tracks by a dandelion. In other words, he was saying, there was much of our world which is terrible. The brokenness, the ruin, the domination, the oppression, the evil. But that was only half of reality. And for him, it wasn't an incredible Mozart sonata, or a sunset in a Californian beach with a glass of wine, or the birth of a baby, or whatever it is for you. For him, it was something as simple as he said of being stopped in his tracks by a dandelion. Part of our human world was horrendous. But there was still the wonder of existence, and he became a seeker because he had to put together a worldview that explained both the dark and the light. And as he said, he could not espouse the darkness. He became a seeker. Or take another great writer of the last century, one of the great English-speaking poets, W.H. Auden. Auden was an Englishman, atheist, left-winger. He'd fought in the Spanish Civil War on the Republican side against the fascists. He hated Hitler, but he came to Manhattan to escape from the lowering clouds of the European war that was coming. And 1938-39, there was no television. And the way people followed the events in Europe was to go to the local cinema on Saturday and watch the documentary News. He didn't know, living in Upper East Side in Manhattan, that the Yorkville audience were mostly Germans. And to be fair to them, it was very early in the war, and the terrible revelations of what Hitler did in the death camps and so on were not widely known at that stage. They weren't known at all. And Auden went to the cinema one Saturday night, and the film was on the siege of Poland. And Nazi stormtroopers were bayoneting women and children. And the German crowd, who of course were pro-Germany, cried out in the darkness, "Kill them," egging on the stormtroopers. And Auden sat there in the darkness, left-wing, atheist. And he said, my whole worldview was turned upside down in 2 minutes. He said, first, I knew looking at that, we humans have evil in our hearts. He said, I'd always thought a little better education or better political arrangements or psychology, we could get over what we call evil. There was no real thing called evil. He said, I looked at that and I knew humans are evil. That's in my heart too. But he said there was a second thing that made him a seeker. He said, all my life as an intellectual, I'd said that there were no absolutes. Everything's relative. Your class, your gender, your race, your background, whatever, everything's relative. He said, but I looked at that evil on the screen, and I knew it was absolutely evil, and I needed an absolute to be able to say it was absolutely evil. I didn't have one. He said, I left the cinema a seeker after an unconditional absolute. It was a signal of transcendence that jolted him out of what he believed and turned him into a seeker. So my challenge to you tonight is I trust that all of you have at least reached that stage, whether curiosity or some problem in our extraordinary universe has started to make you think so that you're looking for an answer that is adequate to all the great challenges of this extraordinary life we live and this extraordinary age in which we happen to find ourselves today. Stage one, a time for questions. Stage two, a time for answers. That's not very profound to go on from the first. But obviously, someone for whom life has become a question wants to look for an answer that will give the meaning that answers the questions. Now, some remarks about this stage. First, this stage is more conceptual. Often people at the first stage have been challenged, even hurt in some way, called into question, and so they don't want to lead with their emotions in any way. They want to set the mind out like a scout to look for an answer, and then, if they're really convinced by it, they will follow and maybe commit themselves to it. But the mind goes out first looking, and this stage is often more conceptual. You're looking at ideas. You're looking at philosophies. You're looking at worldviews. You're looking at the big picture. Which one really illuminates the problem and gives the answer? It's conceptual. The second thing, though, about this stage is it's often comparative. Because the simple fact is that there are many answers out there. So you're looking at this one and that one and seeing which one really provides the deepest, most illuminating, most adequate answer to whatever it is that's challenging you. That's the same as you're a man, you want a jacket. You're a woman, you want a dress, or whatever. A whole number of things that you want to look for. Now, some people immediately say because of that, well, it would take far too long to look into all the answers that are out there in the world. And there are many. But there are two reasons why actually the answers narrow down. One obvious reason is that a seeker only has one burning issue. In other words, we're not dilettantes trying to look at all the possible questions that life raises and all the possible answers that might be given to it. That would be impossible. You'd need 3 lifetimes and a huge bank balance. But a seeker has a particular question and a particular answer that they're looking for. The other thing that narrows it down considerably is that while there are 1,001 answers in the room, shall we say, there are only 3 big families of faiths. By which I'm using the philosopher's word. The fact is, many faiths have a common family resemblance. Because they're in the same family in the sense that they all come out of the understanding of the same ultimate source of reality. Now, if you see it that way, for most practical purposes in our modern world, there are 3 big families of faiths giving us our deepest ideas. The first family is the Eastern family. Hinduism, its reform movement, Buddhism, and especially in California, the offshoots today, the New Age movement, things like that. They all go back to the same sense of the ultimate source of reality, which is an impersonal ground of being. The second big family of faiths are the secularist family. And that goes back to the same source of ultimate reality, chance. Chance plus time plus matter, and that's us. That, of course, includes atheists like Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris, Daniel Dennett, the people who are making so much noise today. It includes many naturalists, materialists, and a certain amount of the agnostic community. And you can see how powerful that is in many parts of Europe and the United States today. The third family of faiths are the Abrahamic, or we would have said until recently, the biblical. And in our Western world, that is supremely Judaism and the Christian faith. Now we say Abrahamic, because clearly the Islamic faith comes out of the same family. And the ultimate source of reality seen in this third family of faiths is a personal, infinite God, or an infinite personal God from whom everything flows. Now, of course, each of those big three families gives you a very different view of life and of humanness and of all sorts of things. And the idea that they're all really the same, and if we talk long enough and we're nice enough to each other, we'd all get to sound happy kumbaya moment when we all agree, is absolute nonsense. No one has ever found the source of underlying common unity. The simple fact is that if you look at history, and you look at the civilizations, and you look at philosophy, there are profound differences between the three families, and the differences make a difference. And anyone who wants to think about the meaning of life, ultimately, has to decide. Now, you could run all sorts of questions through each of those three families. And obviously, we haven't time to do that tonight, and you know that I speak as a follower of Jesus, not a follower of the Eastern religions, or I've lived 10 years in a Buddhist culture, and nor am I an atheist. Although I've known Bertrand Russell, I've known A.J. Ayer, I've known several of the great atheists of our times when I was at Oxford and at London. But I'm a follower of Jesus. But I would challenge each of you who are really open to thinking, and certainly all of you who are seeking, to take some of the big questions of life and run them through each of the faiths. But I would challenge you to read these great thinkers and run them through for yourself. Don't take my word for it. The two biggest questions for me, as I look at our modern world, are either human dignity or evil. Let me take the second one tonight. Far too fast, but at least to give you a flavor of what the seeker does, consciously or unconsciously. The Eastern religions are very realistic about evil. Buddhism is essentially a religion-sized answer to evil or suffering, what they call dukkha, affliction. And as you know, in the Eastern understanding, we are all on the wheel of life. And the wheel is driven by desire, which leads to craving, which leads to attachment, which leads not only to death, but eventually to rebirth. And unlike the groovy Californians in the 60s, for whom it was reincarnation, groovy man, in the East, reincarnation is a matter of weary fatalism. And how do you escape from this world of maya and dukkha, or affliction? You escape from the wheel. But freedom in the East is not freedom to be yourself. It's not freedom to enter into a world of justice and so on. Freedom is freedom from individuality, not freedom to be an individual. Because in the Eastern understanding, individuality itself is the problem. So you don't see any vision of a world of justice and freedom achieved either here or any other time. And nirvana itself is the great deathless lake of extinction. And you can see when Buddha was liberated, say at Bodh Gaya, he didn't say, I am liberated. He said, it is liberated. He had achieved the not self. Now, Buddhism is a very radical answer to evil. But in my view, and the view of many who've looked at it, its diagnosis is profound. Its remedy is drastic. But look for yourself. And don't take what's so common in this country, what the serious Buddhists call boomer Buddhism, a little dabbling with Buddhism, but go right to the end of seeing what it means. There's a particular haiku poem from a Zen poet that has challenged many people on the road to Buddhism. You know the haiku poetry of 17 syllables and so on. One of the most famous haiku poets is Issa, who lived in the 18th century. And he was a poet who had 5 kids, and his wife, of course, and one by one, each of them died. And he was just grief-struck, and he went to the Zen master in order to see how he could handle this, and every time the master said the same thing: remember, the world is dew, D-E-W. In other words, the dew's in the ground, the sun rises, the dew, gone. That's suffering. If you see it from the world that's detached, you don't grieve and mourn and get into these things. The world is dew. Don't grieve, don't mourn, don't get involved. One time after Issa had been told this again and again and again, he went home and wrote a very famous haiku poem that transliterated in English goes like this: the world is dew, the world is dew, and yet, and yet. And as many people realize, the first 2 lines are the pure logic of Buddhism. The world is dew. The last 2 lines are the cry of a human, a father, a husband, for whom the idea that that's all it is simply doesn't satisfy. But as I said, you look for yourself. Or take the secularist position. Secularism does not detach itself. To its great eternal credit, it fights evil. But how? Have any of you ever read, who are atheists or dabbling in atheism, Bertrand Russell's A Free Man's Worship? Everything begins, Russell says, with a blind collocation of atoms and is moving towards the ultimate extinction of the universe. So all we have in a world without any meaning around us is the challenge of creating our own meaning, and we are each like Atlas, who can carry the world of our own meaning, do it yourself, on our shoulders. So his philosophy, as he says quite openly, is built on the firm, I'm quoting, firm foundations of unyielding despair. Poetic sometimes, beautiful sometimes, but bleak if you've read it. When I was searching myself, the one I was absolutely fascinated with was someone who I thought was much warmer, Albert Camus. Any of you read Camus' The Plague? The plague he takes as the image of evil in the world breaking out all over the place. And his hero, protagonist, is Dr. Rieu, who fights the plague for all his worth, not like a Buddhist or a Hindu, detaching himself from life, fighting for all his worth. Warm-blooded, heroic. But, as Dr. Rieu says at the end, as he buries one after another of his friends in the plague, I'm facing never, I'm quoting again, never-ending defeat. Why? In a world without meaning, if everything comes from chance and the world is absurd, what serious hope is there of overcoming evil? As the great German atheist philosopher Schopenhauer says, existence itself is the error. In other words, what we call evil is the error of existence, which is built into existence. So how do you fight what is? And Camus' later picture was of Sisyphus, the man who was condemned to roll the boulder up the hill, rolls down again, roll it up, rolls down again. I rebel, he says, therefore I exist. No hope, finally, except the heroism of tackling it again and again and again and again, if only forlornly. Not long before he died, Jean-Paul Sartre said, atheism is a cruel, long-term business. And I've been through it right to the end, you see. Again, read the great atheists. Don't look at the common-garden suburban atheists, happy-go-lucky people. Read the great atheists who've explored the meaning of life and ask yourself, is that your worldview? And if it is, how can you answer these huge questions and fight the huge challenges of our time? Take the third position, the biblical family. It's too long to say more than a word or two. The biggest challenge thrown at Jewish and Christian believers is what's called the trilemma. How can evil really be evil, and God be really all good, and God be really all powerful? What the Bible does is affirming each of those, but gives them a distinctive twist. Let me just take one of those. Is evil really evil? The Bible says absolutely it is evil. But it should have been otherwise. It was not meant to be this way. So Schopenhauer, whom I mentioned a minute ago, he says existence itself is the error. If evil is written into what is, how on earth do you fight against it? But for Jews and Christians, evil is alien. It is not normal, it's abnormal. It's a gatecrasher, a party pooper. And so when we fight against what's wrong, we fight against what should never have been. And the whole way you see it is different. I remember one time when a very eminent Christian leader had a son who was killed in a cycling accident in France. He was an American leader. And I was living in Switzerland, and we heard the news of this, that this man had come over from the US and had preached at his son's funeral with great hope and confidence. And the man I was living with said simply when he heard the story, I hope this great Christian leader believes what he said in his heart, inside. 3 weeks later, we got a call, could this Christian leader come and talk to my friend? And I remember meeting him, ushering him in. 5 minutes later, we left the chalet. You know, Swiss chalets have wooden walls, often thin. Raise your voice, you can easily hear it. This great Christian leader was cursing God. Why did God take his son? Etc. Anything but hope and trust. And we left the chalet, and later that night, I asked my friend what sort of line of response he'd given. He said, I took him to the Gospel of John and the story in chapter 11 of Jesus at the tomb of Lazarus. Famous passage because it has the so-called shortest verse in the Bible, Jesus wept. But 3 times it says in the Greek, Jesus not only wept, he was furious. One of the words is the strongest Greek word for anger. Aeschylus uses of war horses, hearing the trumpet sound, rearing up on their hind legs, snorting through their nostrils, and charging into war. That's the word used of Jesus. The strongest word the Greeks could use of indignant outrage. Now, why was Jesus furious? He'd entered his Father's will, which he, as the Old Testament puts it, had made good, very good. And it was broken, marred, ruined. And it was all summarized in the death of his good friend Lazarus. And what's his response? He was furious. Why? It should have been otherwise. If sin had not entered and ruined the world, it would have been otherwise. And evil as we know it is terribly evil. But it's not written into existence as the atheist sees it. It should have been otherwise. And when we're shocked and grieved or angry at what goes wrong in our world, we're actually feeling the very thing that God himself feels. Just one tiny strand of the answer of the third position. But as I said to you, the seeker with a question like that, say about evil, would look at each of these and see which answer is the most illuminating and the most adequate with the questions he or she has. Stage 3. Very important one today. A time for evidences. In other words, there's not enough to say, I've got a problem, here's an answer I believe. anyone who thinks seriously should say, this may give me answers, but is it true? That's what philosophers call the justification of belief. That's what lawyers call due diligence. Checking it out. Is it true? Now, I know in the American scene today, a lot of people don't even believe in truth. And truth has fallen on hard times in many campuses. But I would insist, for all thoughtful people, this is a stage that cannot be missed. People need to ask themselves, I'm fascinated. I find this is truly illuminating, but is it true? Now, there's two ways you can examine that. Either a big picture way, the answer really can be seen to be true in a big picture way, or a close-up, detailed way. And depending on questions and depending on personality, people tend to go to one or the other. I mentioned at the beginning G.K. Chesterton. You remember the man who was tempted by pessimism, but was stopped in his tracks by a dandelion. His search was for a worldview, a faith, a philosophy, which would show why the world was so bad at certain points and why there was still a glory to the world and to humanity. And if any of you read his story in his autobiography, it's almost a eureka moment when he, in this case, comes across the Christian faith, which because of its view of sin explains the darkness, and its view of creation explains the light. And Chesterton, as a seeker, he almost says eureka, and the very language starts to get incredibly excited as all the bits start to fall into place. And for him, it's a big picture thing. And he found a worldview which answered both sides of the problem and not just one or the other. Another very famous atheist was C.S. Lewis. You may know his signal of transcendence, as I called it earlier, was what he called surprised by joy. C.S. Lewis was an Ulster atheist, and some of the Ulstermen are very stubborn, dogmatic people. And Lewis says what shook him, though, was these experiences of joy, which he described as unsatisfied desires more desirable than any satisfaction. Not happiness. Happiness, very root of the word hap, comes from our circumstances. Not pleasure. Pleasure, in its essence, is all to do with the five senses. Touch, taste, and all these things. He said joy. And as he began to think about these experiences of joy which came into his life, like a signal of transcendence, they bleeped and bleeped and went beyond his atheism. And it was years later, nearly 20 years of searching. And one day in the Oxford Common Room, one of his fellow dons, who was not a Christian, said, well, you ought to just read the Gospels and look at Jesus of Nazareth. Never read them. And he read the four Gospels. And as many of you know, he said what shook him, looking at the details, was you had on the one side, Jesus was clearly an extraordinary teacher. Love your enemies. All these incredible ethical teachings. But people often stopped with that one side. He said this great ethical teacher made claims which, if they were not true, were more like a madman or a megalomaniac. And that was how he formulated the challenges that came to him. Either Jesus was who he said he was, or he was a liar, or he was a lunatic, or the whole thing was a legend concocted by his followers. And as a literary critic, he looked at each of these and said, the evidence shows you cannot say that he's a liar, or a lunatic, or a legend. But oh my goodness, what does that mean? That maybe he was who he said he was. And that's what finally convinced him of the truth as he looked at it in a close, detailed way like that. So I hope none of you don't do what many in this country do. I've got a problem, here's an answer I believe. But have never really looked into why it can be seen to be true. The fourth stage, a time for commitments. with any seeker, there's a moment in which, with the questions they have and the answers they find, and when they've checked it out, there's a certain point they have to be committed wholeheartedly to this. And there's two very paradoxical things to say about this fourth stage. On the one hand, at this fourth stage of commitment, people feel never more themselves than when they're making that decision. I read the story of a European who was in Kenya translating something about faith, and he was helped by a Kikuyu warrior as his interpreter, and he put down a word, and the Kikuyu friend said, "That's a useless word." He said, "That word would be apt if you had a European rifle and you're shooting an animal at 1,000 yards. All it takes is good telescopic sights and a steady hand and a good eye. That's not our word for faith." He said, "Our Kikuyu word for faith is the word of a lion leaping on its quarry. A gigantic leap and all four legs enfolding what it's killing." He said, "That is faith. Mind, emotions, will, the whole person, knowing they're the whole person, committing themselves to faith." But paradoxically, this fourth stage, a time for commitments, is also the time for many seekers when they're aware, often for the first time, that it's not just them. Because seekers are looking, they're reading, they're thinking, they're questioning, they're talking to people. It's all about them looking and so on. But this fourth stage, as many have discovered, they suddenly realize they haven't so much found God as been found by God, even arrested or tracked down by the hound of heaven, as Francis Thompson put it in his famous poem. But of course, even at this stage, and I've seen this with many and read about it with others, people can, as it were, fall on their knees or turn on their heels. And you can see that humans have an extraordinary choice. I happen to be, as Jeremy said at the beginning, born in a Christian line of our family. I'm very proud of the Guinness family. We've probably done more social responsibility than any corporation in business history. But while my family was Christian, I myself, just because of the accidents of life, didn't grow up with my parents, because they were under house arrest in China, and I was back in England in the school. And so undoubtedly my parents loved me, and they prayed for me, I'm sure. I know they did. But they weren't anywhere near me in terms of any immediate influence. And my own pilgrimage to faith was very much an intellectual odyssey. And on the one hand, I was fascinated with Camus, as I said, and Sartre, and read everything of Nietzsche, and so on. And on one side of the argument for me were these great atheists, and I, as I said, I knew Bertrand Russell. And on the other side, there were thinkers like Dostoevsky, and Pascal, and the great Augustine, and C.S. Lewis, and G.K. Chesterton. And at the end of 3 or so years of reading, thinking, asking friends, and so on, I finally myself became convinced that the Christian faith was not only the most illuminating, but also the most adequate, and the one that could be verified in terms of its truthfulness. And that's my particular story. But I would just challenge every one of you tonight. Here you are at this great university. Many universities give you great grades, great career options and so on, but they don't challenge you to think about a meaningful life. If Socrates is right, the unexamined life is not worth living. Have you examined life, or are you examining life so that you're thinking it through for yourself? So I said, don't take my word for it. I've just tried to outline some of the steps in the journey. But if you're thinking, go and read the great atheists. Go and read Buddha and his story. Go and look at some of the big answers out in our world and explore it to the depth. And ask whether the answers, whatever you're looking at, really answer life in terms of the great intellectual questions and the great practical questions. Because you, as individuals, And then the spouses you marry. You've got to make sense of life. And then as it began, your generation has to move out in this crunch time and answer some of the great challenges of humanity. Many of us who are followers of Christ sum up everything in the wonder of what we found in the famous lines of St. Augustine with which he begins his great autobiography, The Confessions. And he's praying to God, and he says, "You've made us for yourself, and our hearts are restless until they find their rest in you." Jesus says, "I am the way, the truth, and the life." Make sure you're thinking and searching, and by God's grace, you'll find. But over to you for our time of questions. Thank you.
I was just curious at the last part you were talking about how, like, the true seeker, in terms of like Christianity, discovers that more of the journey of seeking is you kind of realize that you weren't finding God, God found you. How is that? Like, I've been a Christian my life, and that's something that always leaves me puzzled. Like, how is it that God found me and I didn't find him?
Take C.S. Lewis. His way of putting it was this. He said, a lot of people in their search, they talk about the answers to life and philosophies of life and the great ideal that might be there. He said, they're like children playing and pretending to be burglars in a living room. And you can pack the excitement of a lifetime of crime into 15 minutes of play. But he said, real faith is when you're playing like that, all of a sudden you hear a footstep in the hall and a real burglar has entered in. And then the hair stands up in the back of your neck and everything changes. He said that's what it was like for him. He was talking about God as an ethical ideal, and suddenly he was aware that God had his hands on his life. And that's why he said, I came into the kingdom of heaven kicking and struggling, the most dejected convert in all England. It wasn't something he rose to with great joy. He was forced to because he believed it was truth and God had found him. Now, it's not everyone's experience. Some people, as Jesus said, are like the person looking for the pearl of great price, and they're bargaining here and looking for a better one, and suddenly they find the real one. That's the seeker's finding. But also many people experience the other. God grabs them.
Thank you.
Please.
First of all, thank you for coming and speaking to us.
My privilege.
My biggest question...
You got an Arsenal sweatshirt on?
I sure am.
Good man.
My biggest question is, in all three of the scenarios you gave, all of the intangibles that humans are seeking to answer, joy, evil, good, meaning, are still open to interpretation as whether or not they're actually objective or just qualia of our perceptions. So how do you go about, first of all, before you ask yourself, is there meaning in life? Ask yourself, do actually all these things exist? So in all of these cases you gave, you talked about evil, either evil being or evil should not have been. But do you ever ask yourself, does evil, does joy actually exist beyond our humanity? Do they actually exist without us, or are they just ways that we perceive the world and perceive what is and would not exist if we didn't?
Mm-hmm. Good question. And you can see that your question grows out of the heart of our modern discussion, which in its postmodern forms, divides the subjective and the objective, and meaning. So you take something like, say, Jacques Derrida, his idea that truth and meaning are, quote, undecidable, because the reader has just as important a view as the author, and so on. You go on and on. We're in the middle of a postmodern age of extreme skepticism. Now, first I would say, such periods of skepticism never last. You had the sophists and you had various other periods. They never last, for a simple reason. Humans can't live that way. And if you want to pour the acid of skepticism on everything, you or a friend, you can. And I would invite you to try. Be skeptical about everything. Nothing's objective, everything's subjective. Nothing has meaning. It's all a matter of perception. Do it radically, all the way down to the line. As my friend Peter Berger says, relativize the relativizers. Don't just be skeptical here, be skeptical everywhere. And then ask yourself, can you live that way? And when you find, as most human beings find, that you can't, you then ask more humbly, I don't mean you, but others who think like that, ask, well, what does it take to undergird the way humans have to live to be meaningful to themselves? Even something as a kiss or a handshake assumes a trust between humans. What underlies something as simple as the trust in reality behind a kiss or a handshake? You take a big thing like science. Science assumes and requires truth, both in the assumption that the universe is observable, but also in things like peer review and all that science depends on. If you really pour the skepticism that you rightly raised as in the air today on science, the whole enterprise would melt down. Or you could take something like journalism. How on earth do we know intelligently what's going on so we can make decisions about, say, democracy? Well, if we're all as skeptical as the postmodern skeptic would call us to be, you can't trust journalism. There's no difference between a journalist and a rumor monger. And with some bad journalists, there isn't much difference. But if we say all claims to truth are rumor mongering, journalism collapses. So I'm saying to you, take seriously what these skeptics are saying and apply it right down the line. And at that point, you'll have to do some sort of deeper rethinking. And I think you'll see that the Christian answer gives you profound answers when you explore what it is that it takes to undergird the way humans have to be lived to be meaningful to themselves, and notions such as truth, objectivity, come in, not just for faith, but for science. Now, when it comes to things like evil or joy, I mean, you'd have to talk to Lewis about what, he was an atheist. What was that experience of joy that was so incredible to him, it set him off searching? I haven't experienced that. I have experienced evil. And my parents experienced evil. I was born in, I didn't experience this, I was born in a part of China where 17 million were killed by the Japanese. We lived in Nanjing, whereas if you know anything about the rape of Nanking, 300,000 were killed in what was reckoned to be the most brutal, sadistic savagery of the 20th century. Even Nazis reeled when they saw the horror of the evil of the rape of Nanking. You could look at the video and you can see some of it. Anyone who's seen evil, read, say, Elie Wiesel, his book, Night. Evil is a palpable reality, which when you've seen it, you know is undeniable. It is not just someone's dislike, magnified to infinitely. So, I admire what you're saying. What you're saying is a distilled expression of a lot of the postmodern skepticism. Live that way if you can. And then apply that skepticism to things like science, like journalism, things that are precious to our world, and see if you can do it. When you can't, then ask if there's a different way of seeing it. I think you'll see there is. But what you're saying is, typically, I was going to say modern question, but it's actually a typically postmodern question.
May I ask one
Please.
more question?
Of course.
What you're saying, does that not present a false dichotomy between a pure skepticism and a supernatural view of the world? Can there not be a way for humanity to live with the meaning that it has created in itself, and to fight against an evil that may or may not actually exist objectively, but that we choose to?
Well, don't keep repeating that. I mean, are you outraged, say, by the monstrous trafficking of women?
Of course.
Well, is that objectively evil, or is it just your way of seeing it?
I think it's a human way of seeing it, but
No, more than that. Is it just a human way of seeing it, or is it something that humans actually do that is real and is done to women.
Oh, of
actually,
course.
objectively done to women. What about the Gulag? What about Auschwitz? Were those objectively evil, or is that just your and my way of seeing it?
I personally think that it is a human way of seeing it. Because without humanity, these ideas of evil wouldn't exist.
Well, of course, because it's humans who do the evil. So without humanity, you wouldn't have had any of those evils. Animals are not the problem. As G.K. Chesterton says, if you look at evil, we talk about wild animals. He says, we are the wildest of the animals. You know, we are the most dangerous animal on planet Earth. Without us, there wouldn't be any evil like this. Animals don't do evil like that. Evil is the intent to do harm, malice, is a human thing. So, of course, without humans, there wouldn't be evil like that.
I sort of see what you're saying. I mean, as my problem with that is our place in the world is so insignificant that isn't it strange that all of these, what we say are the most significant problems or good things in the world, good versus evil, how is it that those are only applicable to us when we're just such a tiny, tiny, finite piece in an infinite universe?
No, you're right on the way you finished the end. We are tiny compared with the universe. Absolutely true. But in terms of planet Earth, we are extraordinarily powerful, and that's why humans in the last century have, for the first time in history, reached the place where we can call into question the future of planet Earth itself. We are extraordinarily significant here. So the way we see things, the way we do things is incredibly important. And if there's a problem in us, we've got to look at how to answer the flaw in human nature. We're not insignificant on planet Earth. Now, I've been in discussions, you know, the probes out there looking and see there's intelligence elsewhere. I was in discussions at further north at the Bohemian Grove. There was a great atheist scientist who entered the discussions. He said, if there's no intelligent life out there, we're lonely and we're meaningless. Not in the Christian Jewish view. We can be terribly small compared with the planet, but we are made in the image of God and a little short of the angels, and we have incredible human dignity. So you're raising questions that, again, point back to why do humans have this dignity? If we're atheists and it's just our size, we're nothing compared with the universe. Well, why not kill 100 million? Why not? They're nothings. In other words, why does every human have dignity? The least educated, the most psychologically damaged, why does each one of them have a precious dignity? Jews and Christians would say, they're made in the image of God. That's the birth of human rights, Wilberforce and other people. If you say we are only who we are without God, well, why do we have any dignity if we're that small compared with the universe? We don't. We're like lice, or mice, whatever. Why kill, 30 of us wiped out tomorrow, or 30 million of us wiped out tomorrow? You tell me why, if there's no reason why we have dignity. Yeah.
I see what you're saying. And
If we could please move to
I'm sorry.
get a few other questions, just to be respectful
Just
of those
keeping
who
it
have
through.
other
Great
questions.
questions.
okay, thank you.
Thank
If you have further questions, we can save that for afterwards. Thanks.
Yeah.
Everybody's familiar with the quote that no man ever knowingly commits a wrong. And you pointed out the flaw in that humans...
Who said that?
Plato? I don't remember. Socrates? Don't know.
Doesn't sound right to me.
It's not...
A lot of people knowingly do wrong. I mean, the man who shot the judge on Saturday and the others knew exactly what he was doing. Anyway,
Well, I mean, if you were saying that, evil is truly objective, then why is it that the people who commit the crimes of human trafficking don't notice that they're, truly... Why would they do it in the first place?
100 reasons. I mean, why do we have a perfect storm of evil? Well, one, we've got a globalized expansion of freedom. Travel and the internet means we can do things unseen or in other parts of the world we'd never get away with in the old conditions. Then globalization means a global expansion of profit. So human trafficking now is second only to the illicit crimes like, say, the sale of drugs. And there's follow the money. Easy to see why the profits from human trafficking are in the billions. Not surprising why people who want money do these things. That's easy to see.
But either way, we agree that there is a flawed humanity and that these things do occur, that we do give in to. Everybody has a decision whether or not to do these things. Would you say?
Yes.
Well, my question is...
Now, some people wouldn't believe that. I do believe there's a flaw in humanity, yes.
With such a flaw in humanity, can it not be true that perhaps we are not in the place to answer the question of whether or not, there is meaning to life? Or that, is it true that... I know the friend that was up here was, truly skeptical, but I mean, is there not some justification for us to be, even a tad bit skeptical or in a little bit of doubt due to the fact of this human flaw, that, what gives us the right to say, that this is the meaning, that this is the truth? You mentioned that there are three
let's be absolutely clear. All of us have to be humble. Only God, as Christians and Jews believe there is a God, others don't, only God, even theoretically, let alone really, only God knows all of truth. All our human claims to truth, because we are finite, have to be open to challenge and therefore have to be stated with humility. So as I said at the beginning, I don't have all the answers to life. I only claim to know the truth because it's been disclosed to us, as I believe, through Jesus. So it's not that I have all the answers to life, but it's been disclosed to us by someone who does. But always with humans, there has to be humility.
Well, yes.
And in that sense, you bring critical questioning, as you said, skepticism. But skeptics are not usually very consistent. In other words, the relativists of the postmodern world, they relativize this, but not that. They relativize our, say, records like the New Testament. They don't relativize their own beliefs. If they're really relativists, they should relativize everything. They should be skeptical about everything, but they aren't.
Well, that's just...
I'm sorry.
Oh.
If we could just, in case this wasn't clear before, one question, one follow-up question max, just to be respectful of everyone else for those questions. I appreciate understanding. Thanks.
Okay, sorry. Oh,
Well,
thank you.
I'll be here afterwards. You want to come up?
Okay, that's fine. Thank you.
So I appreciated your distinction about the answering the big picture versus the small picture. After my own serious skepticism about my faith, I returned because of a big picture answer, which was that Christianity seemed to answer a lot of big questions as far as. So, but one of the things I found is that some of the intellectual answers still remain unanswered, and for instance, the Christian answers to the problem of evil aren't entirely satisfying. And I just wanted to ask you to comment about perhaps the willingness to commit to a faith or a worldview without having all the questions answered, maybe a significant answer, and also the limits of reason in trying to find those answers.
Yeah. Well, deal with the second part quickly. Faith is more than reason, but it's not less. It's more than reason because we are. As I said, when we commit ourselves to God, we're minds, we're emotions, and we're wills. We're one person. So faith is fully rational. As the scientists put it, it's a warrantable faith. It's not against reason, it's not less than reason, but it's more because we are. And that's very important. But pick up the deeper one of where you started. A Christian view doesn't claim to have all the answers to everything. And after World War II, the atheists at Oxford raised the question, is it rational to trust in God if there are questions you can't answer? And there was one believing philosopher who happened to be later my tutor, Basil Mitchell, is still alive, in his 90s now. And he formulated an argument in response to this. It's called the parable of the resistance fighter. And it runs like this. Remember, World War II was just finished, so everyone knew what had happened in the French resistance. Imagine we're in World War II, France, fighting the Nazis. And I come to you in the local bar one night and I say, look, I hear you want to join the resistance. I am the local resistance leader. Let's talk for an hour or two tonight. Ask me any question you like. But if you sign on, you'll obey me blindly. We'll never meet in person. It's too dangerous. And in the war, the horrendous thing in the resistance was the fear of betrayal. Had you trusted the wrong person? And Mitchell argued, for the Christian, there are only two essential questions about God. Is he there? His existence. Is he good? His character. And both of those two essential questions were answered for the Christian in Jesus. If God is the Father of Jesus, I know he's there. And I know he's good. So I trust him in the dark. So many things will happen. My wife had cancer, has cancer. Things will happen in our world that are horrendous. Why? I don't know the answer why. But I know why I trust God, who knows why. And you can see in the parable in World War II, at the end of the war, all the explanations were given. The codes were broken, the secrets were revealed. What the resistance fighter was doing, the leader was doing, was obvious. That's what it would be like. As C.S. Lewis says, at the moment we're in enemy territory. One day we'll know why. There are things in this life look inexplicable. God asked Abraham to sacrifice his son. And you can see many other things. The whole book of Job is about the error of people who try to have answers when they don't have answers, and they're wrong. And God judges them, not Job. So the simple prayer, Father, I do not understand you, but I trust you. We know why we trust God, although we don't always know why God is doing what he's doing in the world. That is not irrational. And Mitchell's parable was reckoned to be a good philosophical answer to the challenge of the rationality of faith that doesn't know all the answers, but it knows what it needs to know. God is there, God is good, so we can trust him in the dark.
Thank you. That's excellent.
If I understand correctly, the basis of your whole speech was that you must strive to be a seeker and question your own beliefs, yes? Pretty much? Okay.
Pretty much.
So then how did you say to the kid who was up here before that being skeptical of everything is no way to live? And don't you need to be skeptical of everything in order to question everything and become a seeker? If you're not skeptical of things, don't you just accept things without proof and without reason?
Absolutely. I was saying to him he wasn't skeptical enough.
No, but you said to him, oh, you can be skeptical about this and be skeptical about that, but once you are skeptical of everything, you're going to realize, or I have no idea, but you said that being
No.
skeptical of everything is no way to
I
live.
said simply, if you look at either history of skepticism or you look at individual skeptics, they're not skeptical enough. In other words, they're skeptical about certain things but not other things. And the fact is, historically, skepticism never survives. And individually, skeptics who are really skeptical come to the end of their skepticism for a simple reason: humans cannot live totally skeptically.
Why not?
They simply can't. You tell me why not.
But
You
if
tell
you
me why
are
not.
not
No,
skeptical
let
about
me
every
finish
single
the-
thing, then you're just accepting things that don't have reason and have no proof.
No. You're just jumping from one end to the other end.
Okay.
When you see that you can't be skeptical about everything, I would say the next step is to say, well, what are the things I need to assume in order to make any livable sense of life? You need to assume there's a reality there. If you pretend there isn't, you'll bump into the wall or the door or whatever. There's certain things we all have to assume. It's not just the grand enterprises like science have to assume that there's reality there, or a human living does. Well, what is it that we have to assume to make sense of life, and what faith, worldview, philosophy of life best undergirds that and makes sense of it in a fully rational way? And I'm arguing to you that it's the Christian faith that does that, but you have to think that through. So certainly, we should all be critical, skeptical, and not accept things on authority, check into them for ourselves. That's terrific. You know, in the New Testament, for instance, there's an example of St. Paul of Tarsus, who gives a speech one night in a little Greek town called Berea. And it says that in this town, the people didn't take him at his word. They went back for themselves and checked out what Paul said by whether it fitted what the Old Testament said. They looked into it for themselves. That's what I'm saying we should all do. And I kept saying, don't take my word for it. Check out the great atheists. Check out the Christian faith for yourself.
Okay. I'm just saying you did say to him that you
I'm
cannot
not-
live being skeptical of everything, but
I said that every time. You're absolutely right. But when you realize you can't be skeptical about everything,
why,
if you want to
why,
live
I don't
humanly.
understand why you can't be skeptical of everything. You never gave reasoning for why you cannot be skeptical of everything.
I said you can try.
Okay.
Do you have a, well, I won't ask you any personal questions, but if you have a boyfriend and you want to kiss him tomorrow night, you start being really skeptical about whether he's there and whether love is anything more than a chemical whatever. You'll realize it doesn't satisfy. Skepticism is intellectually appealing in a short term. In the long term, it's unlivable. And put it another way, there are many thoughts that are thinkable but not livable. So the proof's always in the pudding. As Jesus said, by their fruit you know them, not the seed, it's the fruit. When you test things, C.S. Lewis used to say, take an idea and think it through to the absolute ruddy end. Very English way of putting it. And that's the problem with skepticism. People aren't nearly skeptical enough.
All right, thank you.
Okay? Go the other way.
My
Yes.
question was about where your assumption comes from that there is inherent meaning in answers in life instead of just ones that are derived from either humanity or from your own existence. And then in searching for those, I was a little confused on why. I mean, I understand the three major philosophies and how they are very different, but I wanted to know your opinion on branching in between them and finding your own answers versus...
Yeah, good point. Take the first one. I'm not saying that everyone agrees there's meaning inherent in life. What I'm saying is everyone needs meaning. Now, the Christian and the Jew would say meaning is written into the universe. It is inherent. Bertrand Russell would say, no, it's not. There's no meaning out there. So if you want meaning, you've got to do it yourself. So I'm not arguing that everyone believes there is meaning inherent. But if you do it yourself, it's not surprising that atheism, take for instance, again, evil, the wonderful gentleman earlier. It's a simple fact that the people whose faith collapsed in Auschwitz were atheists. Most of the great atheists after Auschwitz committed suicide. Jean Emery, Bruno Bettelheim, Primo Levi, meant they had no why. Remember Nietzsche's line, he who has a why can bear any how? Atheists had no why. And actually, Viktor Frankl argues, as a Jewish believer, more people deepened faith or discovered faith in Auschwitz than lost it. So I'm not arguing that everyone believes faith, meaning is inherent. No, atheists don't.
No, I wasn't saying does everyone find their meaning. I was more questioning why you find there to be inherent meaning in answers.
Oh, not because of any genius of mine, but because when you discover what we believe is truth in Christ, part of what the understanding of that is, he is the logos, the reason, the meaning behind the very universe itself. And as a matter of faith and its discovery, Christians and Jews believe the universe has profound meaning written into it. Now, we're not the only ones. Platonists and many other people do. Atheists don't. Meaning's all humanly concocted. Well, that's when you have meaning as a do-it-yourself thing. If life's rough, you'll doubt yourself. I don't doubt myself. I know I'm fallible, finite, small, and my meaning is not something I've concocted, thank God. If things were rough, I'd really doubt it. But it's written into God himself and what he's shown us of himself, including the fact the universe has meaning. Now, your second question was interesting too. You're right, I said for all practical purposes, it's the big three. A lot of American philosophers today are calling for a new form of polytheism. In other words, don't care about the big worldviews. If you have a happy marriage and you've got a nice place to live, like San Luis Obispo, you don't have the problems of South El, well, create your worldview out of all the little things that are nice in your world. That's the new way of going about it. There's no grand meaning, but just create your own little meanings, and they're effectively creating new polytheisms. In other words, just as people worship the spirit of the waterfalls or little local deities and so on, we're being told now by some American philosophers, just trust all these little things. But I would challenge you there. Take, say, you might have a wonderful family. Your kids and your wife and your school and your friends, wonderful. I'm not disparaging that. But does the meaning you find in that, or will find in that, does that satisfy you in answering, say, Auschwitz? We've all got to look at these huge things like Auschwitz and see if the faith and the meaning we have can stand up to the big questions. And where I began with Year of the Crunch generation, you're going to face huge questions for humanity. And some of these little beliefs, they're simply going to be too little to answer the big questions. Thank you.
Unfortunately, we just have time for one more question, so if this could be the last question. Although I encourage you, if you have questions either in line or still sitting down, Dr. Guinness has graciously offered to stay afterwards for questions. So if you don't get your question answered now, hang around afterwards and you're more than welcome to talk to him.
No pressure. You're the last.
Last question.
You mentioned skepticism and how it's an era that never lasts. You kind of hinted at it being in our coming generation. What would you say?
Not coming, it's actually disappearing. But you're the tail end of a skeptical generation.
What would you say would be the coming generation, the coming era?
Good question. I was asked that at a breakfast meeting. I haven't a clue. But what I was arguing, the skepticism is the fruit of a long postmodern style of thinking. And you can trace the milestones very simply. Nietzsche in the 1880s. You know, there's no such thing as truth. What we call truth is power. And the next great milestone was Martin Heidegger, probably the greatest 20th century philosopher in the 1920s. The third milestone was Paris in the 60s, when people like Derrida, Foucault, Lyotard, others, the French left-wing radicals, they started to put out what we call post-structuralism, postmodernism. Then it entered the American campuses, its heyday in the 1980s, and in most campuses now it's dying out because it's unlivable. The tragedy is that you've often got many in your generation who've caught the last spill of it and are affected. So the cynicism and the relativism is sort of in the air. And we need to think very clearly and get rid of this. But what's coming next, I simply don't know. I'm not a prophet of the future.
Thank you.
Thank you all. And as Jeremy said, I will be here. Happy to talk to anyone. Thank you.
For more information about the Veritas Forum, including additional recordings and a calendar of upcoming events, please visit our website at veritas.org.